Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking into the life of, well, one of Roman history's most fascinating and frankly complicated figures, Lucius Annaeus Seneca the Younger.
Absolutely. A huge name, philosopher, statesman, playwright. His influence was massive, but yeah, definitely a man of contradictions.
Right. He was right there in the thick of it, navigating the political chaos of the Roman Empire, writing profound philosophy, but also facing some pretty serious accusations.
Exactly. Accusations of hypocrisy, immense wealth, all while preaching Stoic virtue. It's quite a story.
So our goal here is to really dive into the historical accounts we have, trace Seneca's life from start to finish, from Hispania to his very dramatic death, and try to understand him within that turbulent world he lived in.
It's a rich tapestry, lots of threads to pull on. We'll be sorting through the facts and stories to piece together who this man really was.
Okay, so where does this journey actually begin? It wasn't Rome itself, right?
No, not initially. He was born around 4 BC, way out in Cordoba, in what the Romans called Hispania Baetica, basically southern Spain today.
And his family background.
Pretty prominent. They had Italic roots, settlers in Spain. His father, known as Seneca the Elder, was already a big deal in Rome, a famous teacher of rhetoric.
Ah, so the connection to Rome was already there through his father.
Yes, and his older brother, Gallio, became quite important too. You might know him from the New Testament, actually. And his nephew was the poet Lucan. So yeah, a very connected intellectual family.
And Seneca himself came to Rome quite young.
Very young, around 5 years old. An aunt, his mother's stepsister, brought him. His father was, as I said, established there by then.
And his education in Rome, what did that involve?
Well, the usual for a boy of his class: literature, grammar, rhetoric. But crucially, he dove deep into philosophy.
Stoicism, mainly.
Primarily Stoicism, yes, that became his anchor. But he also studied with teachers who mixed Stoicism with Pythagorean ideas, like Attalus and Sophication. Papirius Fabianus was another influence, so a broad philosophical grounding early on.
And there's that slightly unusual detail about him being a vegetarian for a while.
Yes. Briefly, in his early 20s. Apparently, his teacher Sosicon persuaded him.
It didn't last long, though.
No, only about a year. His father leaned on him to stop. Why? Because vegetarianism back then had associations with, quote, some foreign rights, and that can make you suspect in Roman society.
Interesting. A little glimpse of the social pressures even then. Did he have any other challenges early on? I seem to recall something about health issues.
He did. Quite serious ones. He struggled with breathing problems, probably asthma, we'd call it now.
And something more severe.
Yes, tuberculosis. Hit him hard around his mid-20s. It was bad enough that he had to leave Rome altogether to recover.
Where did he go?
To Egypt. He lived with the same aunt who'd brought him to Rome. Her husband, Gaius Galerius, was the prefect of Egypt at the time.
Wow, prefect of Egypt. So Seneca spent time right at the heart of another major part of the empire. How long was he there?
Possibly up to 10 years. A long period of convalescence, but you can imagine he learned a lot about the province and, well, life outside Rome.
And when did he finally get back to Rome?
Around AD 31. Though tragically, his uncle, his aunt's husband, the prefect, died in a shipwreck on the journey back.
Oh, terrible. But his aunt's influence still helped him.
Immensely. It was largely thanks to her connections that he was able to launch his political career. He became a quaestor, probably sometime after AD 37.
And that gave him a seat in the Senate.
That's right. His public life had officially begun.
And he made a mark quicker.
Yes. Reports say he was a brilliant orator, really stood out in the Senate.
But success could be dangerous back then, couldn't it? Especially under someone like Caligula.
Extremely dangerous. Seneca himself wrote about Caligula, calling him a monster. The political atmosphere was, let's just say, volatile.
And there's that dramatic story from Cassius Dio about Caligula wanting him dead.
Yes, an incredible story. Dio claims Caligula was so jealous of Seneca's speaking ability, so threatened by his success, that he actually ordered Seneca to kill himself.
Just for being a good speaker. That's terrifying. How did he get out of that one?
Well, Dio's version is that someone told Caligula that Seneca was so sick, probably with that respiratory illness, that he'd die soon anyway. So Caligula apparently thought, why bother, and let it go.
Huh. Saved by his own ill health, possibly. What was Seneca's take on it?
Seneca framed it differently, more philosophically. He suggested he survived through patience and loyalty to his friends, implying suicide wasn't the only option for someone showing loyalty in tough times. A very Stoic spin, perhaps.
Okay, so he survives Caligula, but his troubles weren't over. Things changed again when Claudius became emperor in AD 41.
Right, and this time the threat came from Claudius's wife, the Empress Messalina, a formidable figure.
What happened?
She accused Seneca of adultery with Julia Livilla. Now, Julia was Caligula's sister and also the sister of Agrippina, a name that becomes very important later.
Adultery with the emperor's sister-in-law. Was there any truth to it, do we think?
Most historians doubt it. Julia Livilla was politically prominent, maybe seen as a threat by Messalina. The accusation looks more like a convenient way for Messalina to get rid of both Julia and influential supporters like Seneca. Politics, pure and simple.
But the accusation stuck.
It did. The Senate actually condemned him to death.
Death. So how did he end up in exile?
Claudius stepped in and commuted the sentence. Instead of execution, Seneca was banished to the island of Corsica.
Corsica. How long was he there?
8 long years. Pretty isolated. But he wasn't idle. He did a lot of writing.
Like his consolations.
Exactly. He wrote the consolation to Helvia, his mother, trying to comfort her about his exile. And it's in that letter he mentions losing an infant son. We don't know who the mother was, actually. An earlier marriage, perhaps.
Interesting. And the other consolation to Polybius.
Ah, yes. That one's quite different. Polybius was a powerful freedman in Claudius's court, and Seneca's letter to him is, well, it's full of flattery for Claudius, clearly hoping Polybius would put in a good word and get him recalled.
Shows a more pragmatic side, maybe?
Yeah.
Less the detached philosopher, more the ambitious politician wanting back in the game.
Precisely. It reveals that tension that runs through his life. Anyway, his wish eventually came true.
How did he manage to get back?
Politics shifted again. In AD 49, Agrippina, Julia Livilla's sister, remember, married her uncle, the Emperor Claudius.
Right, Agrippina. She becomes central.
Absolutely. She used her new influence to get Seneca recalled from exile.
Just recalled. Or did she have bigger plans for him?
Oh, much bigger plans. She got him appointed as praetor, a senior magistrate role, and crucially, she made him the tutor for her own young son. Nero. This was the move that set Seneca up for the most powerful phase of his life.
So, fast forward to AD 54. Claudius dies, maybe with Agrippina's help, maybe not, and Nero becomes emperor. Seneca is suddenly, what? At the very center of power.
Pretty much. For the next several years, roughly until AD 62, Seneca and the Praetorian prefect, a military man named Sextus Afranius Burrus, were essentially running the Roman Empire for the young Nero.
That early period of Nero's reign, the Quinquennium Neronis, is often seen as relatively stable, isn't it?
It is, and ancient historians like Tacitus and Dio give a lot of the credit to Seneca and Burrus. They provided competent government, as the sources say, and importantly, they tried to push back against Agrippina's attempts to dominate her son.
How did Seneca manage Nero's public image?
He was instrumental. He wrote Nero's first big speeches to the Senate, promising to respect the law, restore Senate authority, basically, reassuring everyone he wouldn't be another Caligula.
He even wrote the eulogy for Claudius, didn't he? The emperor who'd exiled him.
He did. Politics makes strange bedfellows. And around the same time, he wrote that incredibly biting satire, the Apocalypse and Tosis, the pumpkification of Claudius, mocking Claudius's deification, while of course praising the new emperor, Nero.
A bit two-faced, perhaps.
You could certainly see it that way. He was definitely playing the political game. He also tried to guide Nero philosophically, after Nero had his stepbrother Britannicus murdered in 55.
A pretty brutal act early on.
Very. Seneca wrote on clemency shortly after. It's addressed to Nero, full of praise, but its real aim seems to be twofold. Reassure the elite that things wouldn't spiral out of control and push Nero towards the Stoic ideal of a merciful ruler.
So for a while, it seemed like Seneca and Burrus were keeping things on track. What went wrong?
Well, Nero was Nero, and Agrippina was still a major factor. The turning point, according to Tacitus and Dio, was AD 59.
The murder of Agrippina.
Yes. Nero decided his mother had to go, and Seneca and Burrus, well, they seem to have reluctantly agreed to it. They felt trapped.
And Seneca had to justify it.
Worse, he had to write the official letter to the Senate explaining why Nero had killed his own mother, claiming she'd been plotting against him. It was a moment that badly damaged their credibility and really marked the beginning of the end of their positive influence.
That proximity to power, even if used for good initially, clearly came at a huge moral cost. And it brought other problems too, right? Like accusations about his wealth.
Big time. Around AD 58, a senator named Publius Sullius Rufus launched a blistering public attack on Seneca.
What was he accused of?
The charges were severe. Suilius claimed Seneca had amassed an absolutely enormous fortune, 300 million sesterces, which was just vast in only 4 years as Nero's advisor.
How? What was the mechanism alleged?
Suilius said Seneca made it through predatory lending, charging extremely high interest rates on loans across Italy and the provinces. He even threw in accusations of sexual misconduct, suggesting an affair with Agrippina.
That sounds pretty pointed. Was Suilius a reliable source?
Probably not. Tacitus himself points out Suilius had his own baggage. He'd been a favorite of Claudius and was known as an embezzler and informer, so likely political payback or personal animosity driving the attack.
But the underlying point about Seneca's wealth? That was true, wasn't it? He was incredibly rich.
Oh, undeniably, no one disputes that. He owned lavish villas near Rome, estates at Baiae on the coast, properties in Egypt. His wealth was immense.
And there's that really striking claim from Cassius Dio, linking Seneca's money lending to the Boudica revolt in Britain.
Yes, Dio suggests Seneca suddenly calling in large loans at high interest in Britain was one of the key factors that pushed the Britons over the edge into rebellion. Now, whether that's the whole story is debatable, but it shows the scale of his financial operations.
So how did Seneca handle these attacks from Suilius? Did he just ignore them?
No, he couldn't. He responded both legally and philosophically. It's thought his work De Vita Beata on the Happy Life was written partly in response to these criticisms.
And in it, he defends being wealthy. How does that square with Stoicism? That seems like the central tension.
It is the central tension, and this is the critique that's dogged Seneca for centuries. In De Vita Beata, he argues that wealth itself isn't bad. A wise person, a Stoic, can possess wealth without being possessed by it. They can use it virtuously, remain inwardly detached, and be ready to lose it all.
So it's okay to be rich, as long as you have the right attitude.
That's the argument he makes. Whether you find it convincing, well, that's another matter. Many saw it as a convenient justification for his lifestyle. It's that core issue. The philosopher preaching simplicity while living in luxury, advising a tyrant.
And he didn't just write a defense, he went after Suilius legally, too.
He did. He prosecuted Suilius for corruption. Suilius was convicted, exiled, and lost half his property. Seneca clearly knew how to use the levers of power when attacked.
Okay, so Seneca weathers that storm, but his position started to weaken after that.
Yes. The real shift came in AD 62, when his colleague Burrus died. Tacitus puts it starkly. The death of Burrus broke Seneca's power.
Why was Burrus so crucial?
They were a team. Burrus commanded the Praetorian Guard, the military muscle in Rome. Together, they could manage Nero to some extent. Without Burrus, Seneca was much more exposed, his influence waning as new, less scrupulous advisors gained Nero's ear.
Did Seneca see the writing on the wall? Did he try to get out?
He did. Tacitus records him trying to retire twice, in 62 and again in 64. He even offered to give his vast fortune back to Nero.
And Nero said no.
Both times. Maybe Nero still valued his counsel, or perhaps he didn't want the political fallout of letting such a famous figure step down. It might have looked like criticism.
So trapped again, in a way. What does Seneca do?
He effectively withdrew anyway. He spent less time at court, more time on his country estates. He really turned inward, focusing intensely on his studies and writing.
And this was a really productive period for his philosophy, wasn't it?
Incredibly productive. 2 of his major surviving works come from these final years.
Which ones?
First, the Naturalis Questions, Natural Questions. It's basically an encyclopedia of the natural world as understood then. Cosmology, meteorology, geology. Quite ambitious.
And the other, the really famous one.
His letters to Lucilius, the Epistulae Moralis ad Lucilium, a collection of 124 letters exploring all sorts of ethical and philosophical questions. They're probably our single most important source for understanding Roman Stoicism and Seneca's personal take on it. Just packed with insight.
A period of intense intellectual activity then. But the political world eventually caught up with him again, didn't it?
Tragically, yes. This brings us to the final act, AD 65 and the Paisonian conspiracy.
A major plot to assassinate Nero. Was Seneca involved?
It's generally thought unlikely he was an active conspirator, but some people involved were connected to him, and in the paranoid atmosphere after the plot was discovered, that was enough for Nero.
So Nero implicated him?
Yes. Nero ordered Seneca, the man who had tutored him, advised him, written his speeches, to commit suicide.
Wow. The ultimate test for a philosopher who wrote so much about accepting death with dignity. How did it happen? What do the sources say?
They give us quite vivid, though slightly different accounts. The basic story is that he followed the traditional Roman method for compelled suicide, opening his veins to bleed out. His wife, Pompeia Paulina, was devoted to him and apparently tried to die with him, cutting her own veins too.
What are the main differences between the accounts, say, Dio's and Tacitus's?
Cassius Dio's version emphasizes Nero's impatience. He portrays Seneca calmly dictating letters while dying too slowly for the soldiers sent to watch, who then had to urge him along.
And Tacitus, his account is usually more detailed.
It is, and maybe a bit more dramatic, possibly colored by Tacitus's anti-imperial views. Tacitus says Nero actually ordered Paulina, saved, her wounds were bound, and she lived on.
But Seneca himself?
Tacitus describes a very slow, difficult death for Seneca. Because of his age and perhaps his simple diet, the blood flowed too slowly. He took poison, probably hemlock, but it didn't have much effect.
So it dragged on.
Yes. Tacitus says he was then moved into a warm bath, hoping the heat and steam would hasten the bleeding. Ultimately, Tacitus reports he was suffocated by the steam in the bath chamber, a grim end.
Tacitus also mentioned something about his funeral rites.
Right. He adds that Seneca had previously specified in a note added to his will, a codicil, that he should be cremated without the elaborate, expensive rites customary for a man of his status, even back when he was wealthy and powerful.
It sounds like Tacitus portrays him facing death with stoic calm.
On the surface, yes. But Tacitus is subtle. Some scholars read his account as slightly ambivalent. While it shows fortitude, there's also a hint of performance. Tacitus mentions Seneca leaving his family an imago sui vitae, literally an image of his life.
An image of his life. What does that imply?
Well, imago could just mean the ancestral mask or bust, but Tacitus might be using it more pointedly, suggesting Seneca was consciously crafting his final scene, leaving behind a carefully constructed image, perhaps even a mask, raising that old question about authenticity versus performance right up to the very end.
Fascinating. So even his death leaves us with questions about his complexity. Let's shift now from the life story itself to his lasting impact.
It's huge, really. In philosophy, his writings were incredibly accessible compared to earlier Greek Stoics. For centuries, he was the source for Stoicism in the Latin West.
And the themes he tackles, they're so universal, aren't they? Managing anger, dealing with grief, facing mortality, using reason, finding resilience.
Absolutely. These are things people grapple with in any era. Seneca provided practical, often eloquent advice that still resonates. His influence on later thinkers, especially during the Renaissance, was enormous.
But he wasn't just a philosopher. Those plays.
Ah, yes, the tragedies. They're quite something. So different from the calm reason of the letters. Full of intense passion, violence, revenge, Medea, Thyestes. Powerful stuff.
Almost the opposite of Stoic emotional control.
Exactly. Which is one of the puzzles about him. Were they written as a kind of warning? Or exploring the dark side he saw all around him? We don't know. There's also the endless debate about whether they were actually staged or just meant for reading aloud.
They were still hugely influential,
Yeah.
right?
Whatever their original context, they had a massive impact on European drama, especially Renaissance playwrights like Shakespeare. The whole genre of revenge tragedy owes a huge debt to Seneca.
So a complex legacy, just like his life.
Yeah.
How was he viewed right after his death and through the ages?
It varied. Quintilian, a famous rhetorician writing a generation later, was quite critical of his writing style, thought it was a bit flashy, lacked substance.
But others admired him.
Surprisingly, yes, the early Christian church developed a real fondness for him. Tertullian called him our Seneca.
A pagan philosopher embraced by Christians. How did that happen?
It's remarkable. Part of it was the perceived high moral tone of his writings. Later, a completely fake correspondence between Seneca and the Apostle Paul was concocted, which further boosted his standing. Figures like Jerome and Augustine even listed him among Christian writers, based partly on this forgery.
Incredible. So his ideas survived through the Middle Ages.
They did, often in collections of quotes or extracts. But then came the Renaissance and a huge rediscovery of his complete works.
And they loved him then.
Oh, absolutely. Thinkers like Erasmus, Calvin, Montaigne, they saw him as someone who made profound Greek philosophy understandable and relevant. Montaigne even called himself a French Seneca.
But did those old accusations, the hypocrisy, the wealth, the connection to Nero, did they fade away?
Not at all. They kept resurfacing. That stock criticism, the gap between the Stoic ideals he preached and the political realities he lived, become a standard critique. His flattery of Claudius and the plea from exile, the savage mockery in the Apocalypse, the sheer scale of his wealth, people kept pointing to these contradictions.
Has the view shifted at all more recently?
Yes, there's been a more nuanced reappraisal in recent decades. Scholars have pointed out the likely bias in sources like Sulius Rufus, people like Anna Lydia Motto, Martha Nussbaum. They argue for finding real originality in his thought,
Originality in what areas?
particularly in his insights into the psychology of emotions. His work on anger is still studied. Also, his political philosophy, his ideas about cosmopolitanism or global citizenship, and even his thoughts on things like gratitude. They see him not just as a conduit for Stoicism, but as a significant thinker in his own right, grappling with problems relevant to his and our time.
So a figure who continues to provoke debate.
Absolutely. He was deeply embedded in the political machine of Rome, experienced the heights of power and the depths of exile, amassed wealth, faced down conspiracies, and died at the emperor's command. And through all that, he produced this incredible body of philosophical and literary work.
The statesman accused of corruption, the philosopher wrestling with wealth, Nero's advisor writing about virtue, the voice of Stoic calm, the author of violent tragedies. The contradictions are stark.
Looking at his life really does give you a window into the politics, the culture, the intellectual life of that whole Roman era. It's all wrapped up in this one incredibly complex man.
So thinking about everything we've uncovered from the sources, can we really draw a neat line between Seneca the philosopher and Seneca the statesman? Between the ideals and the actions?
And maybe the enduring fascination with Seneca, the fact that we're still reading his philosophy and studying his plays. What does that tell us about ourselves, about the timeless human dilemmas he wrote about so powerfully?
Definitely things to keep pondering. We hope this deep dive has given you a clearer picture of Seneca and all his complexity. Thanks for joining us.